I sat on the couch, pretending to scroll through my phone, but in reality, I was just staring at the screen, waiting. The house felt too quiet, almost unnatural. I had spent the past week alone, yet this silence was different. Heavy, unsettling. Then I heard it. The familiar sound of a key turning in the lock. The front door creaked open, and there she was, Lenora, my wife. She stepped inside, dragging her suitcase behind her, eyes bright, lips curled into a wide smile. She was practically glowing. "I'm home," she announced, kicking off her shoes and stretching like she had just come back from a relaxing vacation rather than an exhausting business trip. I forced a smile, getting up to greet her. "Hey, how was the trip?" She let out a small laugh, her fingers brushing through her hair. "Incredible. You wouldn't believe the opportunities one had this week. The meetings, the networking, it was just unreal." Her excitement was contagious, but I couldn't shake the unease creeping up my spine. Something about her was different. Not just the glow in her face, or the lightness in her step. It was the way she looked at me, like she was seeing me through a different lens. I wrapped my arms around her, feeling her warmth against me. For a second, I allowed myself to relax. This was my wife, the woman I had built a life with. Maybe I was just imagining things. But then I caught the scent. Not her usual perfume. This was something unfamiliar. A little too strong, a little too masculine. I pulled back slightly, looking into her eyes. "You seem happy." She grinned. "I am. It was just an amazing experience." Her voice was light, casual, but her hands were fidgeting, something she did only when she was nervous. That's when I felt it. The first crack. I should have asked more questions. I should have paid attention to the way her fingers lingered on her phone, the way she bit her lip when I asked about her trip. But I didn't. I just nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat, and told myself I was imagining things. I had no idea how wrong I was. That first night, something felt off. I couldn't put my finger on it, but Lenora wasn't acting like herself. Sure, she was excited to be home, but it was a different kind of excitement. Forced, almost rehearsed. Like she had played this moment out in her head 1,000 times before stepping through that door. I watched her as she unpacked, tossing clothes into the hamper, setting her toiletry bag back in its place, slipping her laptop onto her desk with practiced ease. It was all so normal. And yet, my gut twisted like I was missing something right in front of me. "You hungry?" I asked, trying to shake the feeling. "I made your favorite, pasta with that spicy sauce you love." She turned to me, her eyes widening just a little, like she had forgotten that I'd be here. "Oh wow, that's so sweet. But actually," she hesitated, biting her lip. "I grabbed something at the airport. I was starving after the flight." Something about the way she said it made my chest tighten. It wasn't the words, it was the hesitation. The tiny pause before she answered. The way her fingers twitched as she tucked her hair behind her ear. I nodded slowly, forcing a small chuckle. "Yeah, makes sense. Plain food is awful. Probably better you ate something decent." She laughed, and for a moment, it felt real. But when she walked past me toward the bathroom, I noticed something on her wrist. A faint mark. Almost like a bruise, but not quite. "Hey, what's that?" I asked before I could stop myself. She froze, then glanced down at her wrist. "Oh, that. Just a suitcase handle. You know how heavy those things get." She flexed her fingers, as if to prove it was nothing. But something about the way she quickly changed the subject made my stomach drop. I told myself I was being paranoid. That she was just tired. That I was imagining things because I had spent too much time alone this past week, overthinking every little detail. But then, later that night, as she curled up in bed beside me, something happened that sent a chill through my entire body. Her phone buzzed. It was late, too late for work messages. I glanced at the screen out of reflex. Just a name. An unfamiliar one. Theo. She grabbed the phone before I could see anything else, quickly flipping it over. "Ugh," she muttered. "Spam. I've been getting so many random texts lately." She turned away, placing the phone on her nightstand, and within seconds, she was nestled under the covers, her breathing evening out like she was already drifting off. I lay there staring at the ceiling, my mind racing. I wanted to believe her. I needed to believe her. But something was wrong, and I was about to find out just how deep it went. I barely slept that night. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying every little detail in my mind, Lenora's glowing face when she walked in, her hesitation when I asked about dinner, the faint mark on her wrist, and most of all, the name on her phone. Theo. It could have been a colleague, a friend, But something about the way she rushed to turn her phone over, the way her voice tensed just slightly when she brushed it off as spam, it didn't sit right with me. By morning, I felt exhausted, but Lenora was as bright as ever. She hummed to herself as she moved through the kitchen, making coffee, checking her emails, acting like nothing had changed. "Hey," I said, leaning against the counter, watching her carefully. "What's your plan for today?" She barely looked up. "Just catching up on work. I need to sort through a ton of emails after the trip." I nodded, taking a sip of my coffee. "So, tell me more about it. You mentioned networking. Who'd you meet?" She hesitated for a split second before answering. "Oh, just a bunch of business contacts. A couple of the executives from the firm we're partnering with, some industry leaders. It was all very productive." I kept my expression neutral, but inside, my mind was racing. She was being vague. Too vague. I knew how these trips worked. She usually had stories, funny moments, little details about the people she met. But now, she was keeping it all on the surface, avoiding specifics. "Sounds like a good opportunity," I said casually. "Did you get much time to explore the city?" Her eyes flickered for just a second. "A little. Mostly just dinners with the team. Nothing crazy." I didn't press her. Not yet. But every answer felt like another crack in the foundation of trust one thought we had. Then something else happened. She got up from the table, coffee in hand, and went to grab her suitcase. "I should probably do some laundry," she muttered. And that's when I saw it. Her suitcase was locked. I'd never seen her do that before. Whenever she got back from a trip, she'd just toss her clothes in the hamper, leave the suitcase open by the closet, let it sit for days before putting it away. But now, she was gripping the handle tightly, her body tense in a way that didn't match her light-hearted attitude. "Need help unpacking?" I asked. She turned too quickly, shaking her head. No, I got it. You don't have to worry about it." I watched as she hurried toward the bedroom, suitcase still locked, and something inside me clicked. She was hiding something. I let her go, but my mind was already made up. I needed to know what was inside that suitcase. And if she wasn't going to tell me, I was going to find out myself. That night, when she finally fell asleep, I made my move. I crept out of bed, heart pounding, careful not to make a sound as I slipped over to the corner where she had left the suitcase. The lock was small, nothing fancy. I knew she kept a spare key in her jewelry box. I hesitated for a long moment, my fingers hovering over the latch. Was I really doing this? Was I really about to go through my wife's things? But then I thought about the way she had looked at me when I asked about her trip. The way she had held onto that suitcase like it contained a secret she couldn't afford for me to know. I found the key, slipped it into the lock, and turned it. The suitcase clicked open. I took a deep breath, bracing myself, then slowly lifted the lid. And that's when my world started to crack apart. The suitcase lid creaked as I lifted it, the darkness of the room making everything inside look like an ominous void. My heart pounded so hard I could feel it in my throat. I hesitated for just a second, a part of me still hoping that I was wrong, that I would open this bag and find nothing but clothes, toiletries, and travel souvenirs. But deep down, I already knew that wasn't going to happen. I reached in, my fingers brushing against neatly folded clothes, the familiar texture of her silk blouses and cotton dresses. Everything looked perfectly packed, too perfect. Lenora was never this organized when she traveled. Normally, she'd shove things into her bag at the last minute, and I'd tease her about it when she got home. But now, each item had its place, carefully arranged as if she had planned exactly how she wanted it to look when she came back. And then, I saw it. Tucked between her clothes was a small velvet pouch. It wasn't hers. I knew every piece of jewelry she owned, and this wasn't something I'd ever seen before. My fingers wrapped around it, the soft fabric pressing against my palm as I slowly pulled it out. I swallowed hard, feeling the weight inside. Something solid, something that didn't belong. I loosened the drawstring and tipped the pouch into my hand. A silver bracelet. Simple. Elegant. Men's. The breath caught in my throat. My fingers clenched around it involuntarily, the cool metal pressing into my skin. This wasn't hers. It wasn't mine. And there was only one possible explanation for why it was in her suitcase. A deep nausea twisted in my stomach, but I forced myself to keep going. I reached back into the suitcase, searching, dreading what else I might find. That's when I noticed something else, tucked deep into his side pocket, almost hidden. An envelope. My hands trembled as I pulled it out. The paper was thick, expensive, the kind used for special occasions. There was no address, no stamp. Just my wife's name written on the front, in handwriting that wasn't mine. I shouldn't have opened it. I knew that. But at this point, did it even matter? I slid my finger under the flap and pulled out the card inside. My eyes scanned the words, but my brain refused to process them for a second. And then, it hit me all at once. I can't stop thinking about you. Every second away from you feels like torture. Counting the days until we can be together again. Yours, always, Theo. The room suddenly felt too small, like the walls were closing in on me. My grip on the card tightened, my chest heaving as I read the words again, as if the meaning would somehow change. But it didn't. Theo. The same name that had popped up on her phone last night. I felt like the ground had just been ripped out from under me. My wife, the woman I had spent years building a life with, the woman I trusted with every part of me, had been with another man. And she hadn't just been with him. She had feelings for him. I sat there in the darkness, staring at the evidence in my hands, my mind racing through every moment of the past week, every little thing I had ignored, every red flag I had convinced myself wasn't real. The way she had glowed when she came home, the way she hesitated when I asked about her trip, the way she grabbed her phone so fast when that message came in. It had all been there, right in front of me, and I had refused to see it. A part of me wanted to storm into the bedroom, wake her up, demand the truth right then and there. But another part of me, the part that felt like a knife had just been driven into my gut, knew that I wasn't ready. Because once I confronted her, there would be no turning back. So instead, I sat there in the dark, gripping that bracelet so tight my knuckles turned white, knowing that everything in my life had just changed forever. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the living room, staring at the card, the bracelet, and the crumpled velvet pouch beside me. My mind was a storm of emotions, each one fighting for control, anger, betrayal, heartbreak. The house felt foreign, like I didn't belong here anymore. How many times had I sat in this exact spot, waiting for her to come home, trusting her without a second thought? Every noise from the bedroom made my skin crawl. The soft rustle of sheets, her quiet, even breathing. She was sleeping peacefully while I sat here drowning in the realization that our entire marriage was built on a lie. At some point, the sun started creeping through the blinds, painting the walls in soft, golden light. And that's when I heard it. The unmistakable sound of Lenora stirring awake. I quickly shoved the evidence back into her suitcase, relocking it as quietly as I could before slipping back into the kitchen. My hands gripped the counter, my knuckles turning white. I needed to play it cool. If I confronted her now, I'd lose any chance of getting the full truth. I heard her footsteps behind me, soft and casual, like nothing had changed. "Morning," she said, stretching as she walked into the kitchen. She looked at me with sleepy eyes, then smiled. "You're up early." I forced a small laugh, reaching for my coffee cup. "Yeah, just couldn't sleep." She leaned against the counter, sipping from her own mug, her body relaxed. "Still adjusting to having me back?" she teased. My stomach turned. I wanted to scream. I wanted to grab that bracelet, shove it in her face, and demand to know who Theo was. But I didn't. Instead, I studied her. She looked normal. Too normal. The same Lenora I had kissed goodbye before her trip, the same Lenora I had trusted. And yet, she wasn't. She glanced at her phone on the counter, unlocking it absent-mindedly. My pulse jumped as I saw the name appear on the screen for just a split second. Theo. She caught me looking. My heart pounded as her fingers hovered over the screen. Then, in a move so casual it almost fooled me, she flipped her phone face down, smiling like nothing had happened. "You okay?" I swallowed the lump in my throat, forcing myself to smile back. "Yeah, just thinking about work." She nodded, distracted, scrolling through her messages. My mind was screaming. She didn't even hesitate before hiding the screen from me. I clenched my jaw, the weight of what I had to do settling in my chest. I needed proof, undeniable, irrefutable proof. Not just for myself, but so she couldn't twist the truth when I finally confronted her. And that meant I had to get into her phone. That evening, I waited. Lenora sat on the couch, scrolling through her laptop while I pretended to watch TV. Every so often, she would glance at her phone, smiling to herself before typing a quick response. The air between us felt forced, like we were both playing parts in a show we knew was about to collapse. Eventually, she got up, stretching. "I think I'll take a bath," she said, yawning. "It's been a long week." I nodded, my heart racing as I saw her leave her phone on the table. She never left it unattended. Ever. As soon as she disappeared into the bathroom, I grabbed it. The screen lit up. A message from Theo. "Last night was incredible. I can still feel you against me." The room spun. My fingers shook. My worst fear, staring me in the face. Then, before I could think, The bathroom door creaked. I barely had time to put the phone back before she stepped out, a towel wrapped around her. Her eyes flicked to the table, then to me. And in that moment, I saw it. The first flicker of fear in her expression. She knew. And now I did too. A second of silence stretched between us, thick and suffocating. I sat motionless on the couch, my heart slamming against my ribs as Lenora's damp hair clung to her shoulders. Her hand tightened slightly around the edge of her towel, and her gaze flicked from me to the phone resting on the table. I saw the moment her mind started racing, the gears turning behind her carefully composed expression. I needed to play this right. If I confronted her now, she'd lie. I knew she would. She'd come up with an excuse, twist the truth, gaslight me into thinking I was imagining things. I wasn't ready for that. Not yet. So I smiled. Forced. Controlled. Like nothing had changed. You all right? I asked, keeping my tone even. She hesitated just a second too long. Then, she let out a small laugh. Forced, high-pitched. Yeah, of course. Why wouldn't I be? She walked over, picking up her phone with a little too much care, like she was testing whether I had touched it. My stomach twisted. Just looked like you saw a ghost for a second there, I added, watching her carefully. She rolled her eyes, shaking her head as she swiped at her screen. I just forgot to text my mom earlier. She asked if I made it back okay. Liar. I'd seen the message. I'd read the words. Last night was incredible. I can still feel you against me. The weight of it pressed into my chest, but I forced myself to stay calm. I needed more. If I accused her now, she'd delete everything. She'd cover her tracks. And I wasn't going to let her slip away that easily. So I played dumb. She worries too much, I said, leaning back on the couch. You were only gone a week. Lenora laughed, a little too quickly, a little too eagerly to move the conversation away from whatever had just passed between us. She sat down beside me, and I felt the distance between us in a way I never had before. A part of me wanted to shove the truth in her face, to grab her phone, throw it across the room, demand answers. But another part of me, the part that had spent the last week ignoring my instincts, needed something undeniable. A confession, something she couldn't wriggle out of. And so I started planning. The next day, I watched her. Every move she made. Every time she checked her phone. Every smile she tried to hide. Every moment she thought I wasn't paying attention. She was careful. She deleted messages almost immediately after reading them. She angled her phone away from me at all times. But she was also confident, too confident. She thought she had control of the situation. That was her mistake. I remembered something. Our phone plan. We shared an account. I had access to the call logs and texts through the online portal. I had never checked before. Never needed to. But now I was ready. While she was in the shower, I logged in. And there it was. Theo's number. Hundreds of messages. Dozens of calls. I scrolled, my hands trembling, my breath shallow. Some messages were time-stamped late at night, when she was supposed to be asleep next to me. Some were early in the morning, before I even woke up. It wasn't just a fling. It wasn't some drunken mistake. This had been going on for a while. I clenched my jaw, scrolling further. Then, something else caught my eye. A reservation confirmation. A hotel. From the same city where her business trip had taken place. My vision blurred at the edges, the realization crashing over me like a wave. She hadn't been working late. She hadn't been exhausted from meetings. She had been with him. My hands curled into fists, rage simmering just beneath my skin. But I swallowed it down. Not yet. Not like this. I closed the browser, locked my phone, and leaned back in my chair, staring at nothing. Now, I had everything I needed. All that was left was to see how far she'd go to keep lying. I sat at the kitchen table, my fingers lightly tapping against my coffee mug. The liquid inside had gone cold long ago, but I wasn't drinking it anyway. I was watching, calculating. Every move Lenora made now was a piece of the puzzle, a performance in a play where she thought she was the only actor. She walked in from the bedroom, stretching her arms above her head, a yawn escaping her lips. She looked normal. No trace of guilt, no nervous glances. It was incredible, really, how easily she wore the mask of a loving wife. How seamlessly she played the role of someone who hadn't just spent a week in another man's arms. Morning, she murmured, making her way to the coffee pot. I tilted my head, studying her. Sleep well? She hummed in response, pouring herself a cup. Yeah, didn't even wake up once. You liar. I had been awake most of the night, lying right beside her, my mind racing with everything I had uncovered. And she had stirred more than once, shifting, sighing softly in her sleep. I wondered if she was dreaming about him, if she rolled over in bed, half expecting Theo's arms around her instead of mine. I slept all right, I said, keeping my tone neutral. She leaned against the counter, scrolling on her phone, probably checking to see if he had texted her yet. My stomach twisted at the thought. How many times had she woken up next to me while secretly thinking about him? I needed to push her, see how much she would lie to my face. You still haven't told me much about your trip, I said casually. What was the best part? She hesitated for a fraction of a second, but quickly masked it with a smile. Oh, I don't know. The whole thing was just amazing. Got to meet some really influential people. Made a lot of good connections. I nodded, swirling my spoon in my coffee, pretending to think. That's good. I actually read an article about that hotel you stayed at. Looks really nice. Did they have a good restaurant? Her posture stiffened just slightly. Oh yeah? The food was great. You went to the restaurant there? I pressed. Another tiny pause. Yeah, she said smoothly. A couple times. Mostly with the team, though. I almost laughed. I had proof, receipts, timestamps, a record of her room's check-in and check-out history. She hadn't been eating with her team. She had been having intimate dinners with Theo, probably in dimly lit corners of the restaurant, exchanging glances over wine glasses, whispering to each other like teenagers sneaking around. But I didn't let my face betray anything. I only nodded, sipping at my now bitter coffee. Maybe we should take a trip together soon, I mused. Get away for a bit. It's been a while since we had a vacation, just the two of us. I watched her closely as she took a slow sip of coffee, her lips barely parting from the rim of the mug. She was buying time, formulating an excuse. That sounds great, she said finally, but there was no enthusiasm in her voice. Just automatic agreement. She didn't want to go anywhere with me. The realization settled in my chest, a quiet, cold thing. I could have confronted her right then and there. I could have grabbed my phone, shoved the evidence in her face, watched her expression crumble under the weight of undeniable proof. But something stopped me. A different idea. She didn't know what I knew. And if I played this right, I could catch her in the act. An idea formed in my mind, sharp and clear. I needed to be patient, calculated. I needed to let her dig the hole deeper. Because once she realized I wasn't the fool she thought I was, her whole world was going to collapse. The hardest part of this whole thing wasn't the betrayal itself. It wasn't the late-night texts, the hidden messages, or the thought of my wife lying in another man's arms while I sat at home thinking she was working. No, the hardest part was keeping my emotions in check, sitting across from her day after day, pretending I didn't know. But I played my role well. For the next week, I watched as Lenora continued her little performance. She'd smile at me like nothing had changed, laugh at my jokes, kiss me goodnight, and then, when she thought I wasn't paying attention, she'd sneak away to check her phone, disappearing into the bathroom for just a little too long. I let her believe she was getting away with it. I let her think she was still in control. And then I set the trap. It started with a simple conversation. I told her I had a surprise planned. You've been working so hard. I thought we should have a weekend getaway. Just the two of us, I said, watching her reaction carefully. She smiled, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. That sounds amazing, she said, forcing enthusiasm. I nodded. I already booked the hotel. The same one you stayed at during your trip. You liked it so much, I figured it would be perfect. Her fingers tightened around her coffee mug. The flicker of panic in her eyes was subtle, but I caught it. She didn't want to go back there. She didn't want to risk running into someone who knew what she had been up to. I let that information settle in her mind, watching the gears turn as she scrambled for an excuse. But I didn't wait for one, because I had one more surprise. I pulled my phone from my pocket and placed it on the table. With a few taps, I opened the call logs. I turned the screen toward her. Funny thing, I said, my voice calm, controlled. I was checking our phone bill the other day and noticed something interesting. Her face went pale. Seems like you've been talking to someone a lot. Late at night. Early in the morning. A guy named Theo. She opened her mouth, but I didn't let her speak. I pulled out the next piece of evidence. The texts. The reservation confirmation. The messages I had screenshotted before she could delete them. Her whole act fell apart in an instant. Her mouth opened and closed like she was trying to form words, but nothing came out. How long? I asked, my voice steady. She didn't answer. How long, Lenora? Her hands were shaking now. It wasn't. Don't lie to me, I cut her off. My patience finally gone. I already know the answer. I just want to hear you say it. Tears welled up in her eyes, but I felt nothing. I never meant to hurt you, she whispered. I almost laughed. That's a funny way of showing it. She started to cry, her hands clutching at the table like she was trying to anchor herself to something. It was a mistake. I got caught up in it. It didn't mean anything. I shook my head. No. See, that's where you're wrong. It did mean something. You chose him. Every single time you texted him. Every time you lied to me. Every time you met up with him. You made that choice. She wiped her eyes, sniffing. Can we fix this? And that's when I realized something. I wasn't sad anymore. I wasn't angry, either. I was done. There's nothing left to fix, I said, pushing my chair back. I already packed your things. You can go stay with Theo. Her eyes widened. Wait, what? I stood up, grabbing the suitcase I had packed for her. I'm not going to scream. I'm not going to beg, and I'm sure as hell not going to compete for my own wife. You made your choice. Now live with it. She looked completely lost, like she had expected me to fight for her. But I wasn't going to. I was choosing myself. And it felt damn good. She stood there, frozen, as I handed her the suitcase and gestured toward the door. You can go now, I said simply. She hesitated for just a second. And then, with a choked sob, she grabbed the handle and walked out. That was the last time I saw Lenora. I won't lie and say it was easy. The first few weeks were tough. I kept catching myself reaching for my phone, half expecting her to call, to text, to show up at my door. But she never did. And eventually, I stopped expecting her to. I moved on. Slowly, but surely. I started going out more, reconnecting with friends I had lost touch with. I focused on myself, on the things that made me happy. And one day, without even realizing it, I woke up and didn't think about her at all. That's when I knew I had one. Because while she was off somewhere, trying to justify what she had done, trying to salvage a relationship built on lies, I was free. And honestly, I had never felt better.